So continuing on now with our discussion of themes within the novel, everybody who reads the novel frequently points out that, yeah, it's in the sentimental tradition, and yeah, a big theme is prudence, blah, blah, blah. But what they rarely do is they rarely look at the third element, and that is the importance of benevolence. And what I want to argue here is that these three concerns of Rosen, she's trying to sort of weave together like strands in a rope or strands of a yarn, and they become very important, and they have something to do with one another. So you read passages where they talk about sentiment. We'll look at that in just a moment on page 139 in my text, beginning of chapter 28. And then you read sections on prudence and then acts of benevolence, which is just kindness towards other people. And you say, these are three different things. I actually think she's trying to do something unified with these ideas within the text. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's take a look at page 139, beginning of chapter 28. It's very interesting that what she is trying to do here, just before she reveals the abject misery that Charlotte is going through, she takes a moment and has her narrator sort of pause and address the reader directly, particularly any kind of reader who might be saying, pish posh, this all a bunch of weepy white, crying, a bunch of sentimental junk. First of all, probably most of the readers weren't feeling that way, but so she's giving them permission to actually indulge their feelings and validates their emotional attachment to the character. But she's really kind of undercutting anybody who might not feel that way and might not have fully identified with the character yet. She says, quote, "Bless my heart," end quote, cries my young volatile reader. "I shall never have patience to get through these volumes. There are so many ahs and ohs, so much fainting, tears, and distress. I'm sick to death of the subject. My dear, cheerful, innocent girl, for innocent I suppose you to be, or you would acutely feel the woes of Charlotte, did conscience say thus might it have been with me, had not Providence interposed to snatch me from destruction. Therefore, my lively, innocent girl, I must request your patience. I am writing a tale of truth. I mean to write it here to the heart. But if perchance the heart is rendered impenetrable by unbounded prosperity, or a continuance in vice, I expect not my tale to please. Nay, I even expect it to be thrown by with disgust. In other words, if you're such a rich, spoiled little kid that you don't care about anybody else, well, probably my tale won't make any difference to you. In fact, you might not like it. So what she's saying essentially is this argument that if you don't feel a response to this character, and if you are sort of this cynical, hard-boiled, stupid girl, she got in trouble, and that's what comes down, I don't care about this, too much weeping and crying and oohing and eyeing. What she's arguing is you're spoiled, you're rich, you're privileged. You don't know what it's like to have to go through this kind of hardship, and you ought to grow up, missy. So she really gives him a tongue lashing there. Methinks I see a satiric smile on your countenance. And what, cry you, does the conceited author suppose we can glean from these pages if Charlotte is held up as an object of terror to prevent us from falling into guilty errors? Does not Leroux triumph in her shame, and by adding art to guilt obtain the affection of a worthy man and rise to a station where what then is the moral you would inculcate? Right? So she's trying to deal with a cynical reader. She's trying to cut him off at the pass, or try to address the cynical reader even beforehand. So in other words, she's really giving sentimental readers permission to be sentimental. She's criticizing in advance of revealing the big emotional event of the novel anybody who might not be a feeling terribly emotional person, really kind of saying, well, the only reason you wouldn't have that kind of feeling is because you've never been through hardship like Charlotte has. Make you feel a little guilt, if you will. But lest you think that sentiment is something that's always and ever indulged in, take a look for a moment at the situation in chapter 7, where we get Leroux constantly goading Charlotte to feel something, or trying to tease her into feeling something. Leroux's such a manipulative person. Look at what she does. She says, this was touching Charlotte in the most vulnerable part. She rose from her seat and taking Mademoiselle's hand, "You know, my dear Leroux, I love you too well to do anything that would injure you in my governess's opinion." Leroux is basically being being bribed to set up Charlotte with this Montreville character. And so she appeals to or calls on Charlotte to, and calls her out and says, well, you don't really love me, you don't really care about me, or you do what I think you should do, etc. So she's really manipulated him. Here on page 63, she says, he's a genteel young fellow, talking about Montreville, said LaRue carelessly, folding up her apron at the same time. But I think he's marked with the smallpox. Oh, you're greatly mistaken, said Charlotte eagerly. He has a remarkable clear skin and fine complexion. His eyes, if I could judge by what I saw, said LaRue, are gray and want expression. By no means, replied Charlotte. They are the most expressive eyes I ever saw. Well, child, whether they're gray or black is of no consequence. You have determined not to read his letter, so it was likely you will never either see or hear from him again. Right? She's really leading her on. It's like, oh, he's got kind of dull eyes. Oh, no, they're really very nice eyes. He's kind of got a lot of like smallpox scars on his face. No, he's got wonderful skin, right? She's really playing Charlotte and getting her to think about his good looks and getting her to think about, well, it doesn't matter. You're never going to read his letter anyway. At least that's what you said. And so she's kind of leading her. And notice that the letter itself is opened by a tear. It's sealed up, but she cries and the teardrop falls on it and unseals the letter and so on. And she constantly is saying, well, I'm going to go this far, but I'm not going to go that far. I mean, I'll read it, but I'm not going to show up. Well, I'll take the letter, but I'm not going to read it, etc. But every time she goes one step further and one step further towards her doom. And all of this is because sentiment, properly cultivated, is a useful thing. Sentiment that is being exploited or that's not being governed properly, very destructive thing. Benevolence is the proper result of being moved to sentiment, right? Good acts are what should result from being moved appropriately by one's feelings or one's sentiment. If you look at page 42 and 43, you get this Eldridge encounter in which you hear in the middle of 42. Here the philosopher was lost in the Father. He rose hastily from his seat and walked toward the window, brushed off a tear he was afraid would tarnish the cheek of a sailor. Temple cast his eye on Miss Eldridge. A pellucid drop had stolen from her eyes and all the tears and tears and tears. Tears are signifiers of a person's humanity. You and I read it and go, holy cow, man, you could float a battleship in all the tears that have been dropped in this novel. 'Tis emblematic, it blotted and discolored 'tis emblematic, said he mentally. The rose of youth and health soon fades when watered by the tear of affliction. But on page 43, "Oh, my father," cried Miss Eldridge, the future Mrs. Temple, tenderly taking his hand, "be not anxious on that account, for daily are my prayers offered to heaven that our lives may terminate at the same instant, and one grave receive us both, for why should I live when deprived of my only friend?" And then suddenly Mr. Temple steps forward and says, "Who were your creditors? What were their demands and other particulars necessary to your liberation?" And he steps in and saves the guy. And it's an appropriate thing. He's generous, and that's not being condemned here. But the most important thing here is that prudence has to govern our sentiments. Her attachment to Montreville is the ultimate imprudent act. Notice how fickle he is and how immature he is on page 106 to 109 when he suddenly is smitten by Miss Julia Franklin, a woman who is beautiful and rich. Suddenly, all of a sudden, he begins to rethink his relationship with Charlotte after he's run off with her, after it would appear he may have even gotten her pregnant. He says, "What am I about? Though I cannot marry Charlotte, I cannot be a villain enough to forsake her, nor must I dare to trifle with the heart of Julia Franklin. I will return this box, which has been the source of so much uneasiness already, and in the evening pay a visit to my poor melancholy Charlotte, and endeavor to forget this fascinating Julia." So he tries to do the right thing, but he's too immature. He's like, this Julia is a hottie, and I know, but no, I'm going back to Charlotte. I'm going back to Charlotte, because that may be a horrible person if I did this. But Then he catches a glimpse of Julia. On page 107, Montraville glanced his eyes on the gray nightgown and black ribbon, and his own feelings prevented a reply. That's about as racy as it gets. He gets a glimpse of Julia in a nightgown, and then, ooh la la, there we go, hubba hubba. He loses all sense. So Julia Franklin was the very reverse of Charlotte Temple. She was tall, elegantly shaped, and possessed much of the air and manner of a woman of fashion. Her complexion was a clear brown, enlivened with the glow of health. Her eyes, full, black, and sparkling, darted their intelligent glances through her long silken lashes. Her hair was shining brown, right? And her features regular and striking. There was an air of innocent gaiety that played about her. She's a worldly and sensual woman. Charlotte he was attracted to because she was innocent and virginal and naive and childlike. Julia is a vixen. She is a hottie, and is very sensual. He sees her in a way that he doesn't see Charlotte, and he's misled by this, right? So his prudence, his lack of prudence, leads him the wrong way. He writes her that letter in which he signs it at the beginning of chapter 20. The unalterable friendship of Montraville. And Charlotte immediately says, friendship? Oh, he friend-zoned her. After seducing her and getting her pregnant. He friend-zones her. So he's a decent person at heart in some ways, but he's ungoverned by prudence. So he knows in other words, he knows, and he's not a great guy, but he knows what the right thing to do is. He just doesn't do it because for whatever reason, he's just not mature enough. Okay. So what I'm arguing here is that there's a whole philosophy being argued up here, and it's more sophisticated than you might think, and it's not disjointed. One must have feeling and cultivate feeling. It is human to do so. Not to do so makes you some isolated, cold, lizard-like reptilian thing. Okay. This, by the way, is in the middle of the era known as the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. And so in the beginning of the Romantic movement. And so there was this feeling that this idea that people had disregarded in favor of science, the human heart. And so we have to cultivate that, but and that is good because it produces good actions and good generosity and human benevolence, acts of goodness. But it has to be governed by prudence, or else it gets out of control. So that's a fairly interesting and sophisticated sort of philosophy she's putting forth. But by the way, it's not wholly original, but it's a fairly sophisticated understanding or grasp of the intricacies of the ethics involved in this sort of thing. The second thing that I want to bring up here is the duty and roles of young women. This is really the third theme. When she faints, he puts her in he's taking her to New York, and she's putting up a resistance, and it's notable that she doesn't just climb on board and jump into the coach and off she goes. Instead, what happens is she faints, and of course that gives the reader permission to think, well, she wasn't all that bad. She just put herself in a bad position, and she didn't willingly go. Ultimately, Rosen has to do it this way because otherwise the reader will think, well, what a tramp she is, right? So she can't be seen as a tramp. She has to be seen kind of as, well, she just kind of put herself in a bad position and made a bad decision, and that's what happens when you do that, right? Beauchamp wants to reunite Charlotte Temple with her parents, but it's too late. The duty that she owes to her parents has been sacrificed by this irrational and imprudent relationship with this young man. But the question I want to ask is, aren't the Temples themselves at fault as well? In some ways, they didn't vet the French teacher. They really should have known better. They really should not have trusted. They really should have done some other things. I'm not trying to lay it all at their feet, but there's some sense here that the Temples didn't really do what they should have done. They weren't as good and vigilant a parent. They were too trusting towards individuals who had contact and relationships with Charlotte and didn't oversee it well enough. They should have known better. They should have kept better tabs, in other words. So there's a duty for young women, but there's also a sort of backhanded criticism of parents, which you're going to see a lot of in the. Now, let's talk about the narrator a little bit. The peculiarly direct, awkward, annoying, odd set of statements that she makes to the reader, or worse yet, to the reader's moms, is a very prominent feature of this particular novel. You'll see it on page 59, where she makes that very famous address to sober matrons. She says, "Now, my dear sober matron, if sober matron should deign to turn over these pages before she trusts them to the eye of a darling daughter." In other words, hey, moms who are reading this over your daughter's shoulder or reading it before your daughter, let me entreat you not to put on a grave face and throw down the book in a passion and declare 'tis enough to turn the heads of half the girls in England. I do solemnly protest, my dear madam, I mean no more by what I have here advanced than to ridicule those romantic girls who foolishly imagine a red coat and silver epaulet constitute the fine gentleman. In other words, hey mom, I'm not praising these guys. These cads, these jerks that go around strutting around in fancy uniforms and seducing these girls. I'm showing you what a bad guy they can be. I'm warning your daughters. I'm not indulging this. And should that fine gentleman make half a dozen fine speeches to them, they will imagine themselves so much in love as to fancy it a meritorious action to jump out of a 2 pair of stairs window, abandon their friends, and trust entirely to the honor of a man who perhaps hardly knows the meaning of the word, and if he does, will be too much the modern man of refinement to practice it in their favor. Gracious heaven, when I think of the miseries that must rend the heart of a doting parent when he sees the darling of his age at first seduced from his protection and afterwards abandoned by the very wretch whose promises of love decoyed her. So this is a big commercial, a big infomercial, if you will, to parents saying, trust me, this is not a book that says go out and just, hook up with any old guy you want to. It's not doing that at all. Why does she feel compelled to do this? Well, obviously she wants the novel to be accepted. Obviously she wants young people to have access to it. And if she thinks that moms are being gatekeepers, that's going to be pretty hard to pull off. But with all art, always ask this question: what did the artist have to gain in doing X, right? If the novel is set in, Bolivia, why do it there? If the novel involves a minor character named this person or a butler or whatever, why put that person in there? Most artists have a reason for all the things that they're doing in that work of art, and you should always ask, what did the artist have to gain in doing it this way? How did doing X help her achieve some goal or some objective? And in this case, these direct addresses to the reader or to the reader's moms, there's got to be some reason for doing it. In other words, she purposefully abandons subtlety for this really direct, didactic sort of address to the reader. And we see this in its focus on the young readers, but ask yourself this: why address the parents? Is it because she also is taking aim at parents? Again, I say this one more time. Parents do not come off well in this. They don't come off well. Parents make foolish mistakes. Parents are the ones that are the cause of all the teenagers' miseries. Actually, that obviously every teenager thinks that's the case, right? Parents are like, my parents are horrible, right? They're horrible. They make my life miserable, etc. So she's kind of pandering to the teenage audience. But at the same time, she takes time actually out to actually lecture the moms and dads. Is she doing that because she really thinks moms and dads are going to read it and will learn from this lecturing? Is she doing it basically to knowing that the moms and dads aren't going to read it, but that the teenager who's reading it will at least say, well, the author's sympathetic to me. The author understands me. She understands how much my parents are making my life miserable and don't understand me. I have a friend in the author. Is that what she's up to? I don't know. But it certainly is an interesting question to ask. For all of that, another key question still remains for us. And I want to continue this in our discussion thread, and I'll send you an email out so that you'll know what you should be doing in terms of the discussion threads and the quiz. What are we to make of this book? Is it progressive, frank, and empowering? Is it saying to young women, listen, I understand you. You're in a double standard predicament here. Is it a sophisticated sort of understanding of that? Is it saying to young women, listen, this is the way the world is, and I'm just trying to give you some clues as to how to navigate this world because girls have it tough? And I don't want to paint too rosy a picture for you. The fact of the matter is that the stakes here are life or death for you. Is it progressive in the sense that it's not just preaching, but it's giving at least some sympathy to the girl who is reading it, who may say, why is my life so confined? It's frank. Is she trying to be frank and saying, look, here's the way the world is? Is it empowering in any sense? To say, look, the more young girls know about what's out there in the big bad world, stop sheltering them so much, let them know this. Or it seems to be saying, listen, kid, stay home and don't dilly-dally around with the wrong dude, because if you do, you know what's coming. You know what you're going to get. And in that sense, you might say, well, it's rather repressive and restrictive because it's really telling young women, listen, you better behave. And by behave, we mean do what society tells you to do and don't step outside. Don't color outside the lines, kid, because if you do, you're a bad person and bad stuff happens to you. Is it using fear tactics, essentially, to enforce traditionally restrictive gender roles? Is it, in short, illuminating or repressive? I think that's ultimately one of the most interesting enigmas of the novel. We'll see what you think in the discussion.